The chapel doors were already open when they arrived, 3 dozen young German POWs in dusty boots and brown uniforms shuffling across the sun-baked earth under guard. The church bell tolled once, then again, and the sound was so gentle, so familiar, it felt like a memory smuggled from home. At first, no one moved. Was this real? A trick? Some sort of punishment wrapped in invitation? They had been told to expect chains, labor, humiliation. But this white-steepled church, with women in pastel dresses, children gripping hymnals, a man in a hat tipping his head and saying, "You're welcome here." None of it made sense. A sergeant hesitated at the door, then nodded. They stepped inside. The pews smelled of pine and polish. A choir hummed softly. One POW froze at the sight of a stained-glass window. Another made the sign of the cross. A third whispered, "What is this place?" The answer was more dangerous than any weapon: grace. And grace, they would learn, has no enemy. They had been warned, not by letters, but by muttered legends passed between barrack walls and bunker doors. The Americans would parade you through the streets, they said. They'd chain you to posts and let civilians spit on you, maybe worse. Some whispered of strange experiments. Others swore they'd make you kneel in front of burning flags. And church? If you saw a church in America, it would be because they were dragging you there to be mocked. That was the story handed down from the Eastern Front to the flak towers, from the officer clubs to the field kitchens. For a German soldier to fall into enemy hands, especially American hands, was to trade the uniform of war for a life of shame. The enemy, they were told, had no God. They had jazz records instead of hymns. They had cartoons instead of prayers. And if you dared believe otherwise, then you had already surrendered inside. So when the train finally stopped and the guards ordered them out, they stepped down like men headed for execution. The heat slapped them first, dry, hard, stretching out across an endless horizon. Texas. No battle maps had prepared them for this. The sun loomed like a punishment, baking the color from the sky, painting everything in harsh, blinding light. A young man from Dresden, barely 19, muttered that it felt like being marched into the afterlife. Around him, the others squinted, blinking through dust. No buildings burned here. No sirens screamed. There was only wind, barbed wire, and land that didn't seem to end. The camp looked like something built for animals: wooden barracks, watchtowers, coiled fencing. But it wasn't the appearance that unnerved them. It was the calm. No barking dogs, no shouted orders, just the occasional flicker of an American voice, relaxed, indifferent. The guards didn't curse. They didn't leer. One even held open the door to a bunkhouse when a prisoner's bag fell open. The man waited for the kick, the insult. It never came. That night, the air inside the barracks was thick with silence, not the silence of peace, but of suspicion. Something was wrong. No punishment had come. Not yet. They lay on thin mattresses, limbs stiff, hearts clenched. The food wasn't good, but it was food. Bread that wasn't black with ash. Beans, boiled but edible. Coffee, real coffee. Some spat it out, convinced it had been drugged. Others ate everything and then threw it up, expecting the backlash to arrive with sunrise. But the backlash never came. That was what made it worse. The Americans acted like this was all normal, like it was their job to feed enemies and then ignore them. Days passed. The guards walked patrols with rifles, but no one used them. The men were counted in the morning, but no one screamed if they stood out of line. The fences remained tall, but the people behind them did not sneer or spit. One prisoner said it aloud. "They're treating us like livestock." Another replied, "No, Livestock get whipped. The truth was heavier than any insult. They had expected cruelty, had braced for humiliation, but the emptiness was worse. The quiet cracked open their thoughts. What game was being played? Why didn't the enemy act like one? Then came Sunday. It began with a note passed from one end of the camp to the other, half rumor, half riddle. "There's a church down the road. They say we can go." No one believed it. Why would Americans let the enemy near a church? Unless it was a trick, unless this was the punishment, make them sit through some sermon filled with shame and threats, some propaganda in a pulpit. But still, the note kept moving. By afternoon, it had become more than a message. It had become a question, and that question, terrifying in its simplicity, demanded an answer. What if it was true? Inside the barbed wire there was no answer, only the wind scratching against the sides of the barracks, the distant creak of a windmill turning slowly, the hum of a place that seemed to have forgotten there was a war. The men waited for the punchline, but Hereford, Texas, didn't laugh. It simply went about its strange rhythm. Morning bell, roll call, breakfast, soft bread, beans, sometimes eggs. Then the Americans would raise their flag while a record player crackled out a tune none of the prisoners recognized. They expected the anthem to blare with teeth, with violence. But it was quiet, slow, the kind of song you might hear in the background of a lazy afternoon. Later, a guard explained it was just a march, something played out of habit more than pride. That word, habit, clung to them. Was that what this place was? A habit of civility? In the afternoons, the Americans played baseball. At first, the prisoners watched from behind the fence, suspicious. The game made no sense. They saw no scoreboards, no medals, just men running in circles, laughing when someone missed. The guards hit the ball hard and ran like children, like no one was watching. It wasn't for dominance or morale. It was for play. Some of the younger POWs leaned against the wire, squinting through the gaps. They whispered to one another, "This is the enemy?" A man who once marched across Poland to the sound of shell fire now stared at a game and wondered why it made his chest ache. They'd grown up with drills, with order barked from throats strained by rage. Here, order still existed, but it floated instead of crushing. The guards reinforced it, but not through fear. They spoke little. Rarely made eye contact. They didn't treat the prisoners like dogs, more like shadows. They gave orders with the tone of bored clerks, not angry, just firm. A few guards even carried books, left copies of the camp newspaper on tables, didn't seem to care if prisoners picked them up. One was seen sketching trees. Another gave a half-smile when a POW held open a door. It was maddening. This wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty. It was something worse. Indifference coated in decency. A new kind of warfare none of the Germans understood. The Americans didn't spit on them, but they didn't salute them either. They just let them exist. And then Sunday came again. No call to work, no drills, no sermons piped into barracks. Just absence. The flag was raised, yes, but no national anthem followed, no boots marching across dirt, just silence, broken by birdsong and the low murmur of cicadas. The Germans stirred uneasily. Some peeked through slats in the walls. Others stood near the fence and watched dust trails drift down the distant road. From time to time they caught glimpses, locals walking into town dressed in their Sunday best. Women in long dresses, boys with combed hair. Some carried books. One even carried a guitar. No one carried a gun. That afternoon, a kitchen worker returned with wide eyes. He had been told something by one of the American cooks. The prisoners could go to town, to a church. On Sunday, It was voluntary, no marching, no punishment, just an open door. The barracks erupted, not with joy, but disbelief. A trick, a test, some kind of re-education trap. The older soldiers scoffed. The younger ones fell quiet. One man, barely 20, whispered, "But what if it's not?" No one replied. They waited for someone to laugh. No one did. The rumor was real. The guards didn't deny it. One even repeated it in careful German. "Wenn Sie möchten, können Sie gehen. If you like, you may go." And just like that, the silence of Sunday became something else entirely. Not absence, not punishment, but invitation. And invitations were more dangerous than orders, because they forced you to choose, and choice, after years of orders and obedience, felt more frightening than any punishment. The word church had not passed many lips since they were children, and now it hovered in the dry Texas air like a ghost. For the Germans, it conjured pews carved in dark wood, incense burning beneath high arches, cold stone floors where you knelt and confessed sins you were too young to understand. But this was America, and they were prisoners. What kind of church would invite enemies through its doors? What kind of sermon would be spoken to the men who helped tear Europe to pieces? In the days that followed the invitation, unease slithered through the camp like smoke. Some called it a lie. Others called it bait. "They'll shame us in front of the congregation," one man said flatly. "Make us apologize. Or worse, parade us like circus animals." Another claimed it was a test of loyalty. If you went, you'd be marked weak, cooperative, a traitor to the fatherland. In a corner of the barracks, someone spat the word "Gottlosen," godless. He meant the Americans, but no one corrected him, because the truth was, many of them had not spoken to God since the bombs began falling. What good had prayer done for Hamburg, for Berlin? But the rumor didn't fade. It calcified into a list. Names posted outside the mess hall. A small group of volunteers chosen for the first visit. 10 in total. Not hand-picked, just those who had quietly written their names on a folded sheet of paper and passed it forward like a message they weren't sure they wanted delivered. Some in the camp turned away when the names were read. Others stared openly, anger blooming on their faces. But no one said a word aloud. They didn't need to. The judgment was heavy in the silence. Inside the barracks, the men who had signed up gathered without speaking. Some sat on bunks polishing their boots until their knuckles burned. Others brushed dust from their uniforms, folding and unfolding the collars again and again, as if searching for something invisible. One of them, a former schoolteacher from Cologne, held his small metal cross in his hand so tightly it left a dent in his skin. "I don't believe any more," he whispered to no one in particular. "But I remember how it felt." Another younger soldier simply nodded and said, "They feed us like we matter. Maybe they pray the same way." Morning came. The guards didn't line them up with rifles. No trucks, no chains, just a corporal with a clipboard and a shrug. They were handed clean belts, told they'd be walking to town. The gate opened slowly, squealing like a door that hadn't been used in years. On the other side, sunlight, a gravel path, a road cutting through flat fields that shimmered in the heat. They walked single file at first, unsure of the pace, the posture. Prisoners still, yes, but not marched, allowed. It was a subtle distinction that left many of them queasy. A boy no older than 21 stumbled slightly, then straightened his back and adjusted his cap. Another, older, took off his hat and carried it in his hand like he would for a funeral. Their boots clicked over loose stones. Birds chirped above them. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang. And when the steeple finally appeared, rising pale and wooden over the trees, not one of them spoke. Because the question, unspoken but roaring in every mind, now felt louder than ever. What church could want us? The question hung in the air like the heat, dry and heavy, even as their boots reached the edge of the chapel lawn. It didn't look like a place for enemies. It looked like a painting. White clapboard siding, shutters swung open to let the breeze pass through. The grass was green, almost unnaturally so, and trimmed with care. A boy in suspenders chased a dog along the gravel path, laughing. Women in pastel dresses stood beneath the shade of oak trees, fanning themselves and chatting softly. From inside came the low murmur of a hymn. It was too soft to make out the words, but the melody drifted like something sacred. It was not the sound of wrath, it was the sound of welcome, and that made it worse. The men slowed, then stopped entirely. The guards behind them did not bark. No one pushed. They waited. It was the Germans who hesitated. Not from pride, but from disbelief. No one had told them what to do now. There was no manual for this. A chapel filled with people who didn't see uniforms, only strangers arriving at their door. The line of POWs shifted awkwardly. A few looked down, brushing dust from their sleeves. Others stood frozen, staring at the church door as if it might swing open and reveal the punchline: laughter, shouting, humiliation. But it didn't. Instead, a man stepped out. A minister, perhaps, or just a local dressed in his Sunday best. He wore a dark suit, hands clasped gently before him, and looked not at their shoulders or their boots or their insignia, but at their faces. "Come in," he said, soft and clear. The words didn't register at first. They had expected to be ordered. Instead, they had been invited. One man removed his cap. Another nodded. Barely, as if tipping his head could erase everything he was carrying. They stepped forward. The door creaked. And inside, the light changed. Stained glass windows cast colors across polished wood floors. The pews were already half filled, families with children, old men with stiff collars, young women with lace gloves. The organ hummed softly, like it had been waiting for them. No one stood. No one stared. A few turned to look. Some nodded. But no one moved away. The Germans moved down the aisle in a clumsy shuffle. A tall POW from Bremen paused, unsure where to go. A woman with gray hair and a blue shawl gently touched the empty space beside her. He sat. She didn't flinch. Across the pews, other prisoners were offered the same silent gesture. Not seats at the back, not the shadows, but space, beside husbands, beside children. As if they were not enemies, as if they were simply there. The youngest among them, barely 19, fumbled to sit, his hands shaking as he folded them over his knees. The wood of the pew felt too soft beneath him, the air too cool. He caught the scent of lavender and polished hymnals. He stared straight ahead, unblinking. Behind him, a toddler giggled at something whispered by his mother. It was the sound of peace, and it cut sharper than any blade. The minister began to speak. Not about war, not about judgment, but about stillness, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to sit beside those we do not understand. One German POW let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Another closed his eyes, just for a moment. They were not prisoners now. They were not soldiers. They were strangers in a strange land. And someone had made room for them on a wooden bench. They had stepped into the unknown. And instead of hatred, they had found hymnals. The organist began slowly, fingers pressing keys with the tenderness of someone waking a child. The notes spilled out into the chapel, soft at first, then stronger, chords swelling into harmony. One by one, the congregation stood. Pages rustled as hymnals were opened, and then voices, unsure at first, rose in song. The Germans remained seated, uncertain, heads bowed or tilted sideways, trying to make sense of the melody. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the sound. It was not a national anthem, not a call to arms, not a cry for vengeance. It was something far more disarming. It was beautiful. One POW, a former student from Leipzig who had studied music before the war, closed his eyes. He did not know the lyrics, but he knew the intervals, the shape of the tune. A simple Protestant hymn, rooted in centuries of prayer. The voices around him did not accuse. They rose like wings, like balm. The man beside him, a local farmer in his 50s, sang with eyes closed, head tilted slightly upward, as if offering his voice not to the roof above, but to something even higher. The Germans did not sing, but they listened, and that listening felt like surrender. When the final note drifted into silence, the pastor stepped forward. He was a tall man, with a face worn by years of sun and prayer, his voice slow and southern, the kind that rolled over you like warm water. His English was gentle, but every word landed with clarity. "We are taught," he said, "to love our neighbor. But what of our enemy? What of the one who marches under a different flag? What of the one we were taught to fear?" He paused, scanning the room. "Grace does not ask who you are. It just asks that you be willing to receive it." The POWs didn't need perfect translation. The rhythm of the words, the quietness in the room, it told them more than vocabulary ever could. Grace. It was not a word they had used much back home. Discipline, yes. Order, duty, shame. But grace? That was softness. And softness had no place in a soldier's world. Yet here it was, spoken aloud from a pulpit, aimed not as judgment, but as invitation. One of the older prisoners shifted uncomfortably. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees. Another stared up at the stained glass window above the altar, where a lamb lay at the feet of a shepherd. The lamb was not German, the shepherd was not American, and yet the message was unmistakable. After the service, the congregation began to rise, stretching limbs, collecting children, folding hymnals shut. The Germans stood too, unsure what was expected of them now. The guards hadn't moved. There were no orders, only the soft shuffle of footsteps and murmured greetings. And then it happened. A young girl, no more than 8, stood beside the man from Bremen. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, then looked up at the soldier, her eyes wide. "God bless you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. He blinked. Once, then again. He didn't know how to respond. She smiled shyly, then disappeared into the crowd. He sat down again. There had been no condemnation, no lecture, no accusation, only a sermon about mercy, a song sung in harmony, and a child who looked at a soldier in a gray uniform and saw someone worth blessing. The others didn't speak as they filed out, hearts knotted in ways no one could explain. Outside, the sun still blazed. The road back to camp stretched long and dusty. But something had shifted. They had come expecting scorn, and left carrying the unbearable weight of being forgiven. The church bell had barely stopped ringing when the congregation began to move, not away, not out of reach, but toward them. For a few terrible seconds the Germans froze. Their instincts screamed at them to brace for something, a slap, a sneer, the recoil of being seen. But what came instead was a smile, a simple, human smile, like the kind that greets a neighbor after a long absence. One woman with gray curls extended her hand, her palm soft, her voice steady. "We're glad you came," she said. her accent thick with the plains. The soldier she spoke to didn't move at first. Then, clumsily, he took her hand. The touch lasted a heartbeat, maybe two. But in that span, something inside him gave way, an old defense collapsing under the weight of gentleness. Around them, others hesitated, then did the same. A man in suspenders offered coffee in paper cups. A teenage boy shook hands with a prisoner twice his age. The air filled with the low murmur of awkward conversation, heavy with pauses, but alive all the same. The language barrier made it strange, halting, full of gestures instead of words. But the tone carried what translation never could. No hatred, no victory, just a quiet curiosity. Who were these men behind the wire? And why did they look so young? One American woman pressed a plate of cookies into a prisoner's hands. He tried to refuse, shaking his head, but she insisted, smiling softly. He looked down at the round shapes, sugar dusted across their surface, and his throat closed. He hadn't held something homemade since the war began. He didn't taste it right away. He just stared. Because the absurdity of it was too much. A housewife giving sweets to an enemy soldier who had once prayed for her country's defeat. When he finally took a bite, he covered his mouth with his hand and turned away. The sweetness undid him. His shoulders shook, though no sound came out. The woman reached out as if to steady him, then simply stood beside him in silence. A child tugged on a POW's sleeve and asked if he was a real German. The man didn't know the words, but the tone made him smile anyway. The boy's mother gently pulled him back, embarrassed, but the soldier shook his head. He knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "Ja," he said quietly. The boy grinned as if he'd just met a storybook character, not a man in a uniform that had once symbolized terror. Something impossible was unfolding, not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition. Humanity exchanged one gaze at a time. When the guards finally gestured toward the trucks, no one moved quickly. The congregation lingered. Some waved. Some called out words the Germans couldn't understand, though they felt the warmth in them. The men climbed aboard slowly, each step heavier than it should have been. The engines coughed to life, and the town slipped behind them, the steeple shrinking into a white sliver against the horizon. No one spoke on the ride back. The hum of the truck's tires filled the silence, mingled with the occasional rattle of a chain or the whisper of wind through open slats. One man still clutched the cookie in his hand, crumbs scattered across his lap. Another stared out at the passing fields, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. The young soldier from Leipzig whispered something under his breath that the others didn't catch. When asked, he shook his head. "I said," he murmured finally, "we were not spat on." That single sentence hung in the air, heavier than any sermon. It was too strange to be comforting, too true to be dismissed. In a war that had taught them to expect hatred, the absence of it was unbearable. They had walked into the heart of the enemy's faith and found not vengeance but grace dressed in Sunday clothes. And as the camp's barbed wire came into view again, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, they all knew, without speaking, that the world inside the fence would never feel the same again. That night the barracks felt different. The air, usually thick with sweat and dust, seemed quieter, almost reverent. No one laughed, no one played cards, no one argued over rations. They lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the hum of crickets outside the wire. Something had been undone inside them, though none could name it. The questions came slowly at first, whispered from cot to cot, like prayers they were afraid to say too loud. What if the Americans weren't liars? What if God didn't take sides? What if we've been wrong about everything? The war had demanded certainty, Every march, every salute, every command reinforced the same iron truth. Obedience meant survival, doubt meant weakness. But now the enemy had shown them something they couldn't fight. Not power, not cruelty, but decency. And it lodged itself like a splinter under the skin. One man, a former sergeant who'd once barked orders at boys younger than his own brother, muttered, "It's easier to hate a monster, but they're not monsters." Another, lying in the dark near the wall, whispered back, "Maybe that's worse." For years they'd been told that God marched with their flag, that the Reich stood for divine order against chaos. But that Sunday morning in Texas had cracked that illusion. The American's God did not wear a uniform. He did not roar from podiums. He was quiet, humble, and alive in gestures, a cookie, a handshake, a child's smile. The memory gnawed at them. Pride fought against it, clawing to reclaim its ground. "They don't know what they did to our cities," someone said harshly. "They bombed children. Don't forget that." Another voice, softer but steady, replied, "And yet they still prayed with us." Sleep came late, and when it did, it was haunted, not by nightmares of battle, but by the image of that church, the sunlight through stained glass, the murmur of hymns, the scent of pine and lavender. For many it awakened memories long buried. Churches back home, their steeples now broken, their bells melted into scrap for shells, the smell of wax candles in winter, the echo of choirs they once sang in as boys. Faith had become another casualty of war, sacrificed to survival, silenced by the sound of bombs. Yet that morning in America, beneath a roof that wasn't their own, faith had spoken again, not as ideology, but as invitation. A young man from Hamburg sat up in his bunk and spoke quietly into the dark. "In our church, before the war, we prayed for victory," he said. "Today, they prayed for peace. Maybe they're the only ones still asking for the right thing." No one replied, but his words lingered, heavy and unsettling. The barracks smelled faintly of soap and damp wood. In the corner, an older prisoner turned something over in his hands. A small, battered Bible, the pages yellowed, the spine split. He had carried it through Poland, through France, through capture, though he hadn't opened it in years. Now, under the flicker of a lantern, he ran his fingers over the cover. His thumb paused on the cross embossed in fading gold. He opened it. The paper crackled. Dust rose. His eyes landed on a verse he hadn't read since boyhood. "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." He stared at the words, unblinking. Outside, a guard coughed, the night wind stirring through the wire. The man closed the book slowly, his hand trembling. "Maybe," he whispered, "God was never on anyone's side at all." And with that, the silence in the barracks deepened. Not empty, but alive, as if the walls themselves were listening to the sound of men learning, for the first time, what it meant to doubt. By the following week, the list at the mess hall filled twice as fast. Men who had once scoffed at the idea of stepping inside an American church now handed in their names quietly, without eye contact, as if afraid they might be seen. No one had ordered them. No sermon had commanded it. It wasn't obligation, it was hunger, not for food, but for something softer, something they hadn't felt in years. Some didn't know what to call it. Others had a word already forming in the back of their minds: grace. Faith didn't return all at once. It didn't arrive with trumpets or confession. It seeped in slowly, like light through the cracks of a boarded-up window. It came in the sound of hymns sung in broken English, rehearsed by candlelight in the corner of a barracks. It came in the awkward pages of donated Bibles, The ones with underlined verses and scribbles from American hands, passed without judgment to men who once wore the Iron Cross. And it came in music. One prisoner, a former music student from Stuttgart, had stood behind the choir one Sunday, watching from the back row, arms crossed. By the next week, he was humming along. By the third, he was singing in harmony, the notes hesitating in his throat, but landing true. The church asked if he wanted to join. He said yes, not because he believed, not yet, but because something in him wanted to believe that it was possible. The Americans had done something the Germans never expected. They disarmed them without a single bullet, not through slogans, not through politics, but through kindness. The kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that didn't ask anything in return. When one of the prisoners broke down after service, unable to explain the tears streaking his face, the minister simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't need to understand it to receive it." That sentence made its way through the camp like gospel. You don't need to understand it to receive it. Even the guards noticed the shift. Men who once marched stiff-backed now paused to hold open doors. They exchanged nods. Some even smiled just slightly when a hymn they had learned floated out from their lips. On one Sunday morning, a POW crouched beside a child on the church lawn and wrote a word in the dirt with his finger: Frieden. The boy tilted his head, puzzled. The soldier smiled and said slowly, "Peace." The boy repeated it twice, then 3 times, until the word became a bridge neither of them needed to cross. They were already standing on it. By then, the camp no longer felt like a cage. It was still fenced, still guarded, still war. But the idea of enemy had become harder to hold on to. Faith had crossed the wire and planted something stubborn in their hearts. Something not German, not American, just human. Have you ever heard of a story like this before? Leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story moved you, please hit the like button, then scroll just below this video and click subscribe. Don't forget to tap the notification bell icon so you never miss one of these powerful stories. Your support helps us keep telling the forgotten truths that history books left behind. The war was still being fought elsewhere. But inside the chapel and inside these men, a different kind of battle was already being won, not with steel, but with mercy, not with flags, but with folded hands. They had arrived as prisoners, but some were starting to feel free. When the news came, it came without fanfare, a radio broadcast, barely audible through the mess hall static. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was no more. The Führer was dead. Berlin had fallen. There were no sirens, no celebrations, no slaps on the back, just silence. In the camp at Hereford, a few men stood and walked outside without a word. Others remained seated, spoons frozen mid-air, as if the news hadn't landed yet. And when it finally did, it hit like thunder, wrapped in cotton, loud but muffled. Some prisoners wept, not for the nation that had betrayed them, but for the men they had lost, the cities turned to ash, the mothers who would now never know what became of their sons. Others sat stone-faced, staring at the Texas dirt. The war they'd fought with their bodies had ended. But the war inside, the one that began in a church pew or a paper cup of coffee shared after a hymn, that one was still raging. For years they had braced for chains and mockery, for hunger and humiliation. But Hereford had offered them something stranger, a routine, a rhythm, and grace where they expected cruelty. Now that the Reich was gone, what remained? They were no longer soldiers, but were they free men, or something else entirely? That week, A chaplain came to the camp and offered paper, envelopes, and postage. "You can write home," he said, as if home still existed. Many hadn't held a pen in months. The first letters came slowly, hesitantly, like limbs learning to move again. Some wrote of food, of blankets, of soft beds and clean socks, but others wrote something harder to explain. "We were invited to a church," one man scribbled in shaky handwriting. "They let us sit beside them. No one watched us like beasts. Some shook our hands, some even smiled." Another wrote to his wife in Dresden. "I am treated better here than I was by my own officers. It makes me ashamed. It also makes me wonder if the enemy we fought ever truly existed." That letter would never reach her. It would be opened, read by a censor, and quietly filed away. Too dangerous, not because it revealed secrets, but because it revealed contradiction. Still, the letters kept coming. Some filled pages with descriptions of hymnals and scripture. Others described the strange ache of hearing the word peace spoken without sarcasm. A few admitted that they no longer prayed for victory. They prayed only to understand. At night, the barracks felt heavier than before. The men had seen war's end, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an unraveling. A man who had memorized battle maps now found himself reciting verses instead. Another who once broke enemy radios now helped sweep the church steps on Sundays. In the quiet that followed surrender, a single question pulsed beneath the surface. Who had shown them more mercy, God or the Americans? No one said it aloud. It was the kind of question that could hollow you out. Because if the Americans had offered more forgiveness than the priests back home, if the enemy had taught them more about compassion than their own country had, then what had they been fighting for? The pastor's words echoed still. Grace does not ask who you are. It just asks that you be willing to receive it. And maybe that was the problem. They had learned how to give orders, take commands, die with pride, but they had never learned how to receive something freely given. The war had prepared them for pain, for discipline, for death. But nothing had prepared them for kindness. Years passed. The fences came down. The uniforms were folded away. Trucks rolled out. Ships waited at port. And one by one the prisoners of Hereford boarded them, heading not for victory, but for rubble, for home, if that word still meant anything. Germany was no longer a nation of triumph. It was a skeleton of ash and brick. Cities they'd loved were unrecognizable. Streets they'd played on as boys were lined with craters. And in the faces of those who had survived, there was hunger, not just for food, but for something that could make sense of the silence. Yet among these men who returned, something had changed. Not visibly, not loudly. It lived in the pauses, in the softening of eyes, in the quiet refusal to curse. Some carried Bibles in their bags. Others slipped folded pages from Texas churches into coat pockets like talismans. One man from Munich took his son to a crumbling chapel and sang him a hymn in English, words he'd once mouthed timidly behind American pews. He didn't explain why. He just sang. Most never spoke publicly of the camp. It was easier that way. The world wasn't ready for nuance. You were either a soldier or a traitor, a victim or a criminal. There was little room for gray, but in quiet corners, over coffee, in letters never mailed or whispered between friends, some truths leaked out. There was a church, they would say, in Texas. They let us sit with them. That was usually enough. The rest stayed buried, too fragile to survive the noise of post-war politics. But a few returned, not as prisoners, not as soldiers, as men. Some came with families years later, during tours through the United States. They drove through the wide plains. the endless horizon of the Panhandle, searching for something that may have only existed in memory. And when they found it, still white, still small, still humming with hymns, they sat in the back row again. Not as enemies, not even as guests, just as people who once, long ago, had been seen. One man married a girl from town. He had met her during his last weeks at the camp. She had been the organist's daughter. Their first conversation was over a plate of cookies and a dictionary. Their wedding, held beneath that same steeple, drew few headlines, but for those who attended, it said more than treaties ever could. The war had made them question everything: God, country, morality. But Sunday morning in Hereford had offered them a new kind of certainty, that mercy was real and that it could live even in enemy hands. A wooden bench, a shared hymn, a child's blessing. These things lingered in their bones long after the barracks had been torn down, and though time took them, as time always does, their memories remained untouched. Some were written in journals, others were spoken only once, then held in silence forever. But they endured, because for men trained to expect hatred, what they found in that chapel was more than unexpected. It was holy. And in the end, that first sentence, the one muttered in disbelief, eyes fixed on a church door, never truly left them. We thought it was a trick. They paused there every time, and then they smiled. But it was grace.